Well, in the last video, I told you I would cut to the chase and get right to the point as far as revealing all this stuff about the Crown Prince of Persia that has been in exile all these years while the ayatollahs took over the rule of Iran, and Persia changed its name to Iran in 1935. So one of the things I said that Crown Prince has said was that when he was praying at the Western Wall, where he visited the Temple Mount, he recalled the 2,500-year-old instance that Cyrus, the great king of Persia, had liberated the Jewish people from captivity, and it helped them rebuild their second temple in Jerusalem, adding that he prayed for a day when Israel and Iran can renew their ties. And I also stated that the Crown Prince of Persia said, hopefully we will elevate the Abraham Accords to the Cyrus Accord and include Iran in the package once we are liberated. And then I told you that Reza Pahlavi posted a picture of himself wearing a kippah and his wife praying at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And his post caption cited the book of Ezra and Cyrus the Great's edict to rebuild the Second Temple on the Farsi social media. Cyrus Accords immediately began to trend with more than 100,000 tweets in 24 hours. And this edict was put forth from Cyrus, the king of Persia. It authorized and encouraged the return to Zion and the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. So obviously what the Prince of Persia is telling you is that he's going to put forth a Cyrus edict, an accord with the Jews in Israel that allows them to rebuild the temple. And this is a stunning prophetic event that will just change everything. So truly, the war that's going on where Israel is taking out these proxies of Iran, these terrorist proxies that have continued over the last 43 years to commit all kinds of crimes and violence all over the world. Israel is in the process of hunting them down and eliminating them. And then I believe that they will install the Crown Prince. He will either become king or the people will accept him as their leader in Iran. But I wanted to remind you of something that happened to the prophet Daniel in 10:13. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me for 21 days. Then Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I remained there with the kings of Persia. So here you had the prince of Judah that, he had been held captive in Babylon, and Persia conquered Babylon. So the king of Persia was there opposing him, and it's really interesting that the Sanhedrin is going to put a king on their throne, and they commissioned the crown that's made of gold to gift to the king when he comes there. I do believe it's King Charles III, but this is a stunning new addition to it, and I believe that there's numerous players involved, including the King of Jordan and the Saudi king, the Saudi prince, and including the Prince of Persia. So I'm thinking, I'm thinking back to when it talks about the restrainer. Everybody has interpreted that to mean the Holy Spirit, which it can mean. However, there is another definition of that nobody ever talks about, and that is that it can be a governmental body that is removed and taken out of the way. And that's kind of what I think is happening, even though it's God that through his Spirit has been restraining. What's been restrained is the rebuilding of the temple all of these centuries. People tried to rebuild it, and God did not allow it to happen. So there's a governmental body right now that is controlling and restraining the temple from being rebuilt until the time of the end. And then that hand of restraint, which I think is a governmental body that's been controlling and oppressing the Temple Mount, because if you look up the words of restrain, it means to oppress. So they've been controlling through the Waqf, the Islamic regime, and they have been preventing the rebuilding of the temple. But the Crown Prince of Persia is now saying he's going to make the Cyrus Accord with the Jews as he was praying on the Temple Mount and allowing them to build their third temple. And these are things that the Holy Spirit helps me to piece together. So let me just tell you what I was going to talk about today, because I'm going to show you why I believe that King Charles III and the Crown Prince of Persia may connect because of the history of what happened in Iran to ancient Persia and how it went from a monarchy to the Iranian revolution, which put these ayatollahs that are evil in power for so long. So here is a little bit of history in how Britain and the United States were involved in the overthrow of the government of Iran. So this is going to be a lot of information. I'll try to say it real fast. This was called Operation Ajax. In March of 1953, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles directed the CIA, which was headed by his younger brother Alan Dulles, to draft plans to overthrow Mossadegh. That was the Prime Minister of Iran. On April 4th, 1953, Dulles approved $1 million to be used in any way that would bring about the fall of the Prime Minister of Iran. And soon the CIA's Tehran station started to launch a propaganda campaign against the Prime Minister of Iran. And finally, according to the New York Times, in early June, American and British intelligence officials met again, this time in Beirut, and put the finishing touches on the strategy. And soon afterward, according to his later published accounts, the chief of the CIA's Near East and Africa Division, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, arrived in Tehran to direct it. In 2000, the New York Times made partial publication of a leaked CIA document titled Clandestine Service History, Overthrow of Premier Mossadegh of Iran, November 1952 to August 1953. The plot, known as Operation Ajax, centered on convincing Iran's monarch, that's Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to issue a decree to dismiss the Prime Minister from office, as he had attempted some months earlier. But the Shah, which is Iranian for king, was terrified to attempt such a dangerously unpopular and risky move against the Prime Minister. It would take much persuasion and many U.S.-funded meetings, which included bribing his sister, Ashraf, with a mink coat and money to successfully change his mind. Mossadegh became aware of the plots against him and grew increasingly wary of conspirators acting within his government. According to Donald Wilbur, who was involved in the plot to remove Mossadegh from power, In early August, Iranian CIA operatives pretending to be socialists and nationalists threatened Muslim leaders with savage punishment if they opposed the prime minister, thereby giving the impression that Mossadegh was cracking down on dissident earlier than planned and stirring anti-Mossadegh sentiments within the religious community. A referendum to dissolve parliament and give the prime minister power to make law was submitted to voters, and it passed with 99% approval. 2,043,300 votes to 1,300 votes against. According to historian Mark Gazlorovsky, there were separate polling stations for yes and no votes, producing sharp criticism of Mossadegh, and that the controversial referendum gave the CIA's pre-coup propaganda campaign to show up Mossadegh as an anti-democratic dictator an easy target. On or around the 16th of August, Parliament was suspended indefinitely and Mossadegh's emergency powers were extended. Declassified documents released by the CIA in 2017 revealed that after the king, the Shah, had fled to Italy, CIA headquarters believed the coup to have failed. Following the initial failed coup by the foreign-backed General Fazlollah Zahedi, the CIA sent Roosevelt a telegram on August 18, 1953, telling him to flee Iran immediately, but Roosevelt ignored it and began to work on the second coup, circulating a false account that Mossadegh attempted to seize the throne and bribed Iranian agents. Soon, massive popular protest, aided by Roosevelt's team, took place across the city and elsewhere with tribesmen at the ready to assist the coup, with anti- and pro-monarchy protesters both being paid by Roosevelt by paying mobs to demonstrate. Sound familiar? Tricking Mossadegh into urging his supporters to stay home and bribing and mobilizing officers against Mossadegh, he was able to force a military confrontation outside Mossadegh's home. The protests turned increasingly violent, leaving almost 300 dead, at which point the pro-monarchy leadership, led by retired Army General and former Minister of Interior in Mossadegh's cabinet, Fazlollah Zahedi, interceded and joined with underground figures such as the Rashidian brothers and local strongmen Shaban Jafari and pro-king tank regiments stormed the capital and bombarded the prime minister's official residence. With loyalist troops overwhelmed, Mossadegh was taken into hiding by his aides, narrowly escaping the mob that set in to ransack his house. And the following day, he surrendered himself at the officers' club where General Zahedi had been set up with makeshift headquarters by the CIA. Zahedi announced an order for his arrest on the radio, and Mossadegh was transferred to a military jail shortly after. The king, the Shah, finally agreed to Mossadegh's overthrow after Roosevelt said that the United States would proceed with or without him, and formally dismissed the prime minister in a written decree, an act that had been made part of the Constitution during the Constitutional Assembly of 1949, convened under martial law, at which time the power of the monarchy was increased in various ways by the king himself. As a precautionary measure, he flew to Baghdad and from there hid safely in Rome. He actually signed 2 decrees, one dismissing the prime minister and the other nominating the CIA's choice, General Zahedi, as prime minister. And these decrees, called Farmans, played a major role in giving legitimacy to the coup and were further spread by CIA officials. On August 22nd, the Shah, the king, returned from Rome. Zahedi's new government soon reached an agreement with foreign oil companies to form a consortium and restore the flow of Iranian oil to the world markets in substantial quantities, giving the United States and Great Britain the lion's share of the restored British holdings. Now, this is how I believe King Charles definitely comes into play, and how President Trump would get back in power and come into play with the Cyrus Accord. In return, the U.S. massively funded the king's resulting government until the Shah's overthrow in 1979. As soon as the coup succeeded, many of Mossadegh's former associates and supporters were tried, imprisoned, and tortured. Some were sentenced to death and executed. The Minister of Foreign Affairs and the closest associate of Mossadegh, Hossein Fatemi, was executed by order of the Shah's military court. The order was carried out by firing squad on November 10th of 1954. And since the CIA of the United States and Britain's government under their monarchy sought this plot to depose the Prime Minister of Iran, this is how King Charles comes together with the Prince of Persia to allow the Jews to rebuild their temple. The British government had grown increasingly distressed over Mossadegh's policies and were especially bitter over the loss of their control of the Iranian oil industry. Repeated attempts to reach a settlement had failed, and in October of 1952, the Prime Minister of Iran declared Britain an enemy and cut all diplomatic relations. Since 1935, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company had the exclusive rights to Iranian oil, and earlier in 1914, the British government had purchased 51% of its shares and became the majority shareholder. After the British Royal Navy converted its ships to use oil as fuel, the corporation was considered vital to British national security, and the company's profits partially alleviated Britain's budget deficit. So see, Britain has played a huge role in what has happened, and right now I believe Israel is trying to overthrow the ayatollahs and eliminate them permanently so that they can put the Prince of Persia, that was the Shah's son, back into power. Whether he becomes king is a question. He could just be a civilian leader that they accept. Engulfed in a variety of problems following World War II, Britain was unable to resolve the issue single-handedly and looked towards the United States to settle the matter. Initially, the U.S. had opposed British policies. After mediation had failed several times to bring about a settlement, American Secretary of State Dean Acheson concluded that the British were destructive and determined on a rule or ruin policy in Iran. The American position shifted in late 1952 when Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president. In November and December, British intelligence officials suggested to American intelligence that the Iranian Prime Minister should be ousted. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill suggested to the incoming Eisenhower administration that Mossadegh, despite the latter's open dislike of communism, would become reliant on the pro-Soviet Tudeh party, resulting in Iran increasingly turning towards communism and towards the Soviet sphere of a time of high Cold War fears. Though his suggestion was rebuffed by Eisenhower as paternalistic, Churchill's government had already begun Operation Boot and simply waited for the next opportunity to press the Americans. On February 28, 1953, rumors spread by British-backed Iranians that Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran, was trying to exile the king, the Shah, from the country, gave Eisenhower's administration the impetus to join the plan. The United States and the United Kingdom agreed to work together toward Mossadegh's removal and began to publicly denounce Mossadegh's policies for Iran as harmful to the country. In the meantime, the already precarious alliance between Mossadegh and Kashani was severed in January of 1953 when Kashani opposed Mossadegh's demand that his increased powers be extended for a period of 1 year. And finally, to end Mossadegh's destabilizing influence, that threatened the supply of oil to the West and could potentially pave the way for a communist takeover of the country, the U.S. made an attempt to depose him. So the U.S. and Britain, who want that oil and want to have a huge say over the oil in Britain, would have King Charles III being involved, and you can see how it all falls into place. And then the President of the United States would be involved as well. So the 1953 coup in Iran, rioters armed with staves shouted slogans during riots in Tehran, Iran, August of 1953, following the overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The 1953 coup in Iran, coup d'etat in Iran that occurred August of 1953, funded by the United States and the United Kingdom, it removed Mohammad Mossadegh from power and restored Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi as Iran's leader, as their king. They restored the monarchy, and some 300 people died during fighting in Tehran. With its strategic location and vast oil reserves, Iran was of special interest to the United States, the United Kingdom, and other powers. Britain had established a presence in the country during World War II to protect a vital supply route to its ally, the Soviet Union, and to prevent the oil from falling into German hands. After the war, the United Kingdom effectively retained control over Iran's oil through the establishment of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This arrangement changed abruptly in 1951 when the Iranian parliament, led by Mossadegh's nationalist and democratically elected government, voted to nationalize the country's oil industry. Seeing its interests thus threatened, the UK embarked on a secret campaign to weaken and destabilize Mossadegh. At first, the British government tried to convince the Shah, the King of Iran, to remove Mossadegh from office by engineering a parliamentary decree, a ploy that both failed and enhanced Mossadegh's reputation while diminishing the king's. When the push to remove Mossadegh evolved into the idea of a coup to overthrow the government, Britain, reluctant to shoulder the responsibility alone, persuaded the U.S. to join forces by playing on Cold War fears that Mossadegh, an avowed anti-communist, was aligning himself with Tuda, the Iranian Communist Party. The United States took the leading role in a covert operation called Operation Ajax, whereby CIA-funded agents were used to foment unrest inside Iran by way of the harassment of religious and political leaders and a media disinformation campaign. These efforts, formally approved by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, came to a head in August of 1953 when Mossadegh and his government were overthrown and Mohammad Reza, a pro-Western monarch, was returned to power. The coup nearly failed, however, because the king, the Shah, feared for his throne, vacillated over signing the royal decree the CIA had prepared to sanction the change of government. Fighting between supporters of both sides resulted in hundreds of deaths. Mossadegh was imprisoned for 3 years and then lived the rest of his life under home arrest. And it is generally agreed today that the 1953 coup sowed the seeds for the Islamic Revolution of 1979, in which the Shah, the king, was overthrown and went into exile and came to live here in the United States under the help of President Jimmy Carter, a Democrat. In 2013, the CIA formally disclosed its role in the coup. Presidents and monarchs, Jimmy Carter and the Shah of Iran, the king, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, whose son is the one that's going to get back into power with the help of the U.S. and the help of Britain, is going to make the Cyrus Accord with the Jews to rebuild their temple. So Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was the last Shah, king of the imperial state of Iran. He ruled the nation for over 37 years from September 16, 1941, until his overthrow in the Iranian Revolution on February 11th, 1979. And he came to power during World War II after a combined invasion by Britain and Soviet forces forced the abdication of his father, Reza Shah Pahlavi. So they've been messing with their country all this time. It's unbelievable. And during much of the Shah's reign, foreign powers sought control of the valuable Iranian oil industry. The British were the first, but the oil industry was nationalized by Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1951, and this proved to be unpopular with Western nations. Those in the administration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower feared that communists were poised to overthrow the government. Just before the 1952 presidential election in the United States, the British government invited Central Intelligence Agency officer Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, to London to propose collaboration on a secret plan to force Mossadegh from office. And this became the first of 3 regime change operations led by the CIA Director Allen Dulles. The CIA and British Secret Intelligence Service funded and led a covert operation to depose the Prime Minister of Iran with the help of military forces, and led a covert operation to depose Mossadegh with the help of the military forces disloyal to the government, referred to as Operation Ajax. And despite the support of these 2 great powers, the coup initially failed, causing the Shah to flee to Baghdad and then to Rome. And while in exile, the king signed orders to dismiss Mossadegh as prime minister and replace him with General Fazlollah Zahedi, a choice agreed on by the British and Americans. A second coup was successful in deposing Mossadegh, reinstalling the king, and returning foreign oil firms to Iran. The Shah introduced the White Revolution, a series of economic, social, and political reforms aimed at transforming Iran into a global power and modernizing the nation. Supporters of the banned National Front were persecuted, but the Shah, the king, ordered that most of the members of the National Front would be brought to trial, including Mossadegh. These leaders were not executed as many had expected, and many in the Iranian elite were openly disappointed that the Shah did not conduct the expected bloody purge and publicly hang Mossadegh and his followers. On February 27, 1958, a military coup to depose the Shah, led by General Waliullah Ghorani, was unsuccessful, and this led to a major crisis in Iranian-American relations when evidence emerged that associates of Ghorani had met American diplomats in Athens. In January of 1959, the Shah began negotiations on a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, and this was met with a threatening letter from President Eisenhower warning him against signing the treaty. And when the Shah chose not to enter into a treaty with the Soviets, this led to a major Soviet propaganda effort calling for his overthrow. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev ordered the Shah's assassination. The Shah's first major clash with Ayatollah Khomeini occurred in 1962 when the Shah changed the local laws to allow Iranian Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, and Baha'i to take the oath of office for municipal councils using their holy books instead of the Quran. This was unacceptable to Khomeini. At first, the Shah refused to do so, but then he later bowed to pressure from demonstrations organized by the clergy and withdrew the offending law. However, it was reinstated as part of the White Revolution of 1963. The Shah initiated major investments in infrastructure, subsidies, and land grants for peasant populations, profit sharing for industrial workers, construction of nuclear facilities, the nationalization of Iran's natural resources, and literacy programs. He also instituted economic policy tariffs and preferential loans to Iranian businesses which sought to create an independent economy for the nation. And let me just say right here, Don't you find it really strange that the Biden administration and the Obama administration funded Iran with millions upon millions of dollars from the United States? Is this leading to the overthrow to put the king, the Crown Prince of Persia, into a position of power there in Iran? Well, manufacturing of motor vehicles, appliances, and other goods in Iran increased, and these reforms led to decades of sustained economic growth that would make Iran one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Iran enjoyed economic growth rates exceeding the United States, Britain, and France. National income rose 423 times over. By 1977, Iran's armed services spending, which the Shah saw as a means to an end foreign intervention in Iran, had made the nation the world's fifth strongest military. But his reforms also led to growing unrest among the religious sects. And in 1963 and 64, nationwide demonstrations against his rule took place all over Iran, with the center of the unrest being the holy city of Qom. Students studying to be imams at Qom were most active to the protests, and Ayatollah Khomeini emerged as one of the leaders, giving sermons calling for the Shah's overthrow. At least 200 people were killed in the demonstrations, with the police throwing some students to their deaths from high buildings. Khomeini was exiled to Iraq in August of '64, and many critics labeled the Shah as a Western and American puppet. In particular, when the Carter administration, which took control of the White House in 1977, they viewed the Shah as a troublesome ally. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the king, was diagnosed with chronic lymphocytic leukemia in 1974. As it worsened, he stopped appearing in public in the spring of 1978, and the official explanation was that he was suffering from a persistent cold. In May of 1978, the Shah suddenly canceled a long-planned trip to Hungary and Bulgaria, and he spent the entire summer of 1978 at his Caspian Sea resort, where France's most prominent doctors, Jean Bernard and Georges Flandrin, treated his cancer. Nationwide protests and strikes were taking place in Iran at the time, but it was difficult for the Shah to make decisions, possibly because a side effect of his medications was depression. And in June of 1978, the Shah's French doctors first revealed in the French government how serious his cancer was. And in September, the French government informed the American government that the king, the Shah, was dying of cancer. Empress Farah suggested numerous times that he leave Iran for medical treatment and appoint her regent, but the Shah saw that as too humiliating for him as a man to flee Iran and leave a woman in charge. By 1978, growing political unrest snowballed into a popular revolution. The actions of the Shah's military fueled public opposition. At the Jala Square massacre, the Shah's military killed and wounded dozens of protesters. The Cinema Rex fire was an arson attack in Abadan that was falsely blamed on Savak, the Iranian secret police. This led to protests across Iran, making the Shah's position in Iran untenable, and the Shah left Iran and went into exile on January 17th of 1979. And the Shah claimed that he did so to avoid having to attack his own people. But the total number of protesters killed by his military ranged anywhere from 2,000, according to historians, to 60,000, according to the Islamic Republic of Iran. The government fell, and the Iranian monarchy was formally abolished, and Iran was declared an Islamic republic led by Ruhollah Khomeini. And ever since then, it's been terror everywhere throughout the world with all of their proxies and themselves. Iran, under the Shah, had been a valuable U.S. ally as well as a dependable source of oil exports. The Carter administration, as well as its predecessors, overlooked human rights violations in Iran, and President Jimmy Carter had visited Iran in late 1977. Carter had authorized the sale of U.S. fighter aircraft to Iran. Carter soon found himself in a difficult position as the Shah's administration fell, and an Islamic revival all led to increasing anger among Iranians, many of whom also despised the United States for its support of Pahlavi. The Carter administration debated internally over demands for greater human rights in Iran. This angered the Shah. Secretary of State Cyrus Vance made it a high priority, while National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski warned that this would undermine the strength of America's most important ally in the Middle East. Carter allowed the sale of riot control equipment to Iran to suppress the increasingly violent protests. And when the 1978 Iranian Revolution had broken out, Secretary of State Vance argued that the Shah should institute a series of reforms to appease the voices of discontent. Brzezinski argued in favor of a crackdown on dissent. After the Shah went into exile and the Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile in February of 1979 to popular acclaim, the unrest continued, and Carter decided to allow the Shah into the United States to receive medical treatment for his cancer. Carter and Vance were both initially reluctant to do so because of concerns about the reaction in Iran, but ultimately allowed the Shah to come to the United States. And in November of 1979, shortly after Pahlavi was allowed to enter the U.S., a group of Iranians stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 66 American captives, beginning the Iran hostage crisis. Iranian Prime Minister Mehdi Mazargan ordered the militants to release the hostages, but he resigned from office after Khomeini backed the militants. Carter vowed to secure the release of the hostages. He refused the Iranian demand of the return of Pahlavi in exchange for the release of the hostages. At first, Carter's approval ratings rose as Americans rallied around his response, but the crisis became increasingly problematic for his administration the longer the hostages remained in captivity. An attempt to rescue the hostages, Operation Eagle Claw, in April of 1980 was a total disaster. It ended in the death of 8 American soldiers. The failure of this operation strengthened Ayatollah Khomeini's position in Iran and badly damaged Carter's domestic support. Iran refused to negotiate the return of the hostages until Iraq launched an invasion in September of 1980, with Algeria serving as an intermediary. Negotiations continued until an agreement was reached in January of 1981. In return for releasing the 52 captives, Iran accepted over $7 billion in monetary compensation and the unfreezing of Iranian assets in the United States. Iran waited to release the captives until hours after Carter left office on January 20th of 1981. The Shah left the U.S. for Panama. While the Shah was in Panama, one of Khomeini's close advisors, Sadek Gotzada, had a meeting with Hamilton Jordan, Carter's chief of staff. Gotzada requested that the CIA kill the Shah while he was in Panama. The Shah learned of this and left Panama, delaying further surgery. He fled to Cairo, Egypt. The Shah, the king of Persia, slipped into a coma and died at 9:15 a.m. on July 27, 1980, at age 60. Egyptian President Sadat gave the Shah a state funeral. Former President Richard Nixon was one of the persons who attended that funeral. In 2016, the BBC published a report which stated that the administration of United States President Jimmy Carter, 1977 to 81, had extensive contact with Ayatollah Khomeini and his entourage in the prelude to the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The report was based on newly declassified U.S. diplomatic cables. According to the report, as mentioned by The Guardian, Khomeini went to great lengths to ensure the Americans would not jeopardize his plans to return to Iran, and even personally wrote to U.S. officials and assured them not to worry about their interests in Iran, particularly oil. According to the report, in turn, Carter and his administration helped Khomeini and made sure that the Imperial Iranian Army would not launch a military coup. In his memoir, Answer to History, the Shah claimed that the little-known Khomeini was able to ignite the 1963 demonstrations in Iran with help from foreign agents, and that U.S. President Kennedy initially wanted him out of power before later changing his opinion of him. The Shah also claimed that President Jimmy Carter was another liberal president who reminded him of Kennedy. and who wanted to interfere in Iran's affairs. In a year prior to the revolution, big oil contracts with Iran were expiring. However, the companies never sought to renew the contracts with the Shah, which according to him was a blackmail threat. Ultimately, the Shah claimed that the Americans and British colluded against him due to his 1973 nationalization and oil price hike. The BBC report also showed a 1980 CIA analysis which portrays Khomeini's attempts to contact the U.S. as far back as 1963 during JFK's administration. Iran's political elite has dismissed these declassified reports. Ayatollah Khomeini stated that it was based on fabricated documents. Ibrahim Yazdi, formerly a close associate of Khomeini, and Saeed Hajarian viewed the BBC report with skepticism. A declassified cable shows that on November 9th of 1978, William H. Sullivan, then U.S. ambassador to Iran, alerted the Carter administration of the Shah being doomed. Sullivan stated that the U.S. should get Iran's Shah and his most senior generals to exit the country and construct an agreement between the secondary commanders and Khomeini. In January of 1979, General Robert Husher was dispatched to Iran. According to the narrative of Carter's government, Husher was sent to promise U.S. support for the Shah. However, the declassified reports show that Husher was in fact sent to Iran in order to prevent the Iranian military leaders from orchestrating a coup in order to save the Shah. He was also reportedly tasked with convincing the Iranian military leaders to meet Mohammad Beheshti, Khomeini's second-in-command. Husher was soon faced with accusations of neutralizing the Iranian military for paving the way for Khomeini's ascension to power. So I'm going to have to cut this short now, but the bottom line is you can see why the Biden administration funded Iran. You can see that they're going to put the son of the Shah in power so that he can broker a certain type of peace in the region. And it will be a false peace because the only peace will come from Yeshua, Jesus Christ, the Messiah, when he comes. So all of this is setting up with the leader and the monarchy of Great Britain, the UK, King Charles III, President Trump, and any of the US presidents really, and Iran and its leaders, and this Prince of Persia that is the Crown Prince that will make the Cyrus decree to rebuild the third temple. I'm sorry I have to cut this short. I don't have any memory left in my card here, so I'll leave it at that, and I'll say I'll see you in the next episode. I hope this was informative. It's a very long, deep story, and this is just a taste of what our governments did in Britain and the U.S. to cause all of this unrest that's been going on all of these years. It's astonishing. So you can see how they funded Iran, sent billions of dollars over there, and nobody understood why, because it's setting the stage for the return of the king of Persia's son to possibly take the throne and create a peace over there in the Middle East, which won't last. So with that, I'll say I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for your support and thumbs up. You know the story. So I'll see you later. Have a great rest of your afternoon.